the anger.
So desire to control is not really an addiction, it's covering an addiction, is that?
That's correct. Yeah, the desire to control is not really an addiction, it's covering a fear. So all of these things, anger and addictions, all cover fears. That's the point of them. That's why we create them. We create them because we want our fears to be assuaged, to go away. We want them to disappear, and we're not prepared to feel them. And so what we do instead of that is we hold on to them, and then we use addictions and then rage or anger, if the addictions are not met, as a tool to control our environment. And so the whole attempt to control is not an addiction itself, it's an avoidance of fear that causes control. So in a relationship, if you're trying to control your partner, it's avoiding a certain fear. That's why you're trying to control them. If in a work situation, any other driving car, any other situation where you're trying to control other people, it's to avoid fears. There's been whole religious faiths created to avoid fear. So, for example, most religious faiths are created by a few elect people who are afraid that other people might be immoral if they don't have a religion. So what they do is they create a whole heap of laws, like the Ten Commandments, a whole heap of laws that are all really based around trying or attempting to control a group of other people, because the persons who made the laws are all afraid of what will happen to the other people or themselves if everyone doesn't follow those laws. So you'll be surprised, even in our culture and also in the entire world's history, what's been created just because of trying to avoid a fear. And if you look at religiously, people have gone to war to enforce the commandments that have been created by other people. And why have they done that? Because they feel a huge level of fear that if you don't follow those commandments, God will do something to you. You won't have God's approval, or you won't have God's acceptance, or you'll lose everlasting life, or you'll lose some kind of future existence, or you'll go to hell, or whatever the belief is. And these belief systems have been created most of the time because somebody historically wanted to control, and all of the desire to control comes from their own fears. So we've got whole religious faiths created because of fear. We've got whole political systems created because of fear. We've got whole environmental and systems created because of fear. Economic systems created because of fear, because we're all too afraid and we all don't want to feel fear, so we create all of these addictions and all of these controls in order to get away from fear. So to be frank with the majority of, in everyone's case, fear is your primary enemy in a lot of ways. Now, you can view it as an enemy or view it like I view it. I view it sort of like a friend, because it tells me everything about myself that I've yet to heal. So every time I feel a fear, I go, this is really good. I can feel that fear I've got going on here. Like, let's say it's a fear of somebody's violence. I can feel that fear. What are you prepared to do to avoid somebody's violence? Well, most people are prepared to be violent in return to avoid somebody's violence, or even to be preemptively violent. In other words, do something to the other person before they do something to you. And with myself, I go, okay, I feel this fear, and if I live in it, it's going to be my enemy. But if I feel my fear and work my way through it, it's going to help me, therefore be my friend. It's going to help me grow. And so the key is to start seeing fear as our friend. But for the majority of us, we don't want to feel fear. It's a terrible emotion to feel. Most of us who have ever felt it would say it's probably one of the worst emotions to feel. And so what we have a tendency to do is either overcome it. So a lot of men, what they do is challenge their fears constantly in a desire to overcome their fears. Or we do what a lot of women choose to do, and that is completely deny it altogether and just live in addiction or rage. And that's what we do.
So trying to overcome a fear doesn't really eliminate it?
No, not at all. What you need to do, there's only two things you need to do to feel fear. One, put yourself in a situation where you are afraid. Two, allow yourself to feel the terror itself. Allow yourself to feel it as a feeling. That's the only two things you need to do with fear. It's really simple dealing with fear, but you try doing it. It's really hard when you try doing it, because most people start feeling the fear and then they'd want to do anything other than that, anything. And, people will do all sorts of things just to stay away from fear. They'll even murder to stay away from fear. Why do you think there's around 50 million abortions every year around the world? Because there's 50 million women and men who want to avoid certain fears, and they're willing to murder children to avoid those fears. Like, as a society, we're willing to do so many things just to avoid a fear. And there's only we only have to do two things. One, place ourselves in a situation where the fear is triggered. Two, allow ourselves to feel the fear. We don't have to take any other action, but most people don't do that. Most people take an action to help their fear go away. Yeah. Mm. And we will do, like, mankind historically has done terrible things to avoid fear. Terrible things. We're even willing to create an arsenal of nuclear weapons to avoid fear that's so big that if it was all unleashed at one time, it would completely destroy humanity. That's how willing we're able to go to avoid the fear of security, for example, personal security. Like, that's, if you look at all of the things that are created on the earth that we're all... And ironically, it heightens their fear. Now everyone's afraid somebody's going to push the button, sort of thing, like, well, don't create the weapon in the first place. That would surely be the best answer, but unfortunately that's what we do because we're already afraid and we don't want to acknowledge it and we don't want to feel it. And so what we do is we project it and we create circumstances around us that cause our fear, in fact, to increase in most cases. And that's the law of attraction in work. Yeah. But fear is one of the biggest emotions that each person on the planet will have to, at some point, choose to feel rather than choose to avoid. Yeah. And most of us don't. We choose to avoid, manipulate it, get away from it, do something to manoeuvre around it. That's what we do with our fears. So all of your anger, pretty much all of your anger, is caused by fear. Now, that's a well-recognised psychological fact, actually. Most psychologists would say to you that all of your anger is caused by fear. Of course, they draw the line at some things, like they draw the line at fear of death. That to them is a justified fear, and to me it's not. There's no such thing as death anyway. You live forever, so whether you live here in a physical body or live in a spirit body, it doesn't really matter. You're living forever. So to me, there is no justification of doing something even when you're faced with death. But the average person on the planet who doesn't believe those things will go, no, there are certain times when your fear is justified. And everyone on the planet has some justification of the fear that exists inside of themselves, where they don't want to feel it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And particularly the justification of fear of death. Most people are very, very afraid of death at all sorts of levels.
Or the death of a loved one.
Yeah, the break, in particular, death usually causes for most people what they perceive as the breakage of a relationship that they want to hold on to of some kind, or a breakage of the relationship with Earth, or a breakage of their ability to use their body in ways that they'd like to use it. They feel that that's not going to be possible. And so they have all sorts of fears that govern why they will prevent death at all costs, prevent their own death, I mean. And they're willing to shoot another person in other words, kill another person to prevent their own death. And that's fear that causes us to do that. If we're not in a state of fear, we don't feel that way. We would never be willing to shoot another person or harm another person just to prevent our own death. Yeah. But see, these are all things that are justified on the planet at the moment. And so if you allow yourself to feel it, the world around you justifies a certain level of fear. If you read any psychologist manuals or books, you'll find that there's a justification of certain types of fear. When it comes to self-preservation, there's a justification of all sorts of fears. So while psychologists acknowledge that anger is created by the denial of fears and the lack of acceptance of the emotion of fear, they also support that in certain circumstances. And that might be they support it in the circumstance where your own life is threatened, for example. And so many psychologists, of course, would support war rather than saying that war is unnecessary. And it's all because of fear in the end. Yeah. Fear is the work you're going to have to do at some point. In fact, it's going to be the main work you have to do. Because if you had no fears right now and you really had a desire for God right now, what would happen? You'd already be at one with God. Does that make sense? You'd already be at one with God. If you had no fear and a desire to have received God's love, you would have already received God's love right to the point of at one with God. It's only your fear that prevents it. So it's always fear that you've got to do most work with. And that applies to me as well as yourself.